British business and the whiff of foreign grape shot. Our industries respond to competition from abroad in various ways. Some like the idea of a siege economy, running for cover behind a protective wall against imports. Many manufacturers do feel that they have a strong case for protection.
Well, just how serious is it? I mean, how deep is the import penetration now?
In stainless steel flatware, in stainless steel spoons and forks, by units, by volume, it's something like 95% of the market. And this has grown dramatically, particularly from the second half of the 60s until by the second half of the 70s, this industry was feeling the pinch very badly.
So you're saying that 95 out of every 100 knife, forks and spoons in this country are imported?
That's right. The employment has dropped from something around the 20,000 mark after World War II to something like 4,000 today. And of that 4,000, many are on short time.
The once proud cutlery industry of Sheffield. Ernest Mills is the last of a line of small master craftsmen producing hand-finished metalware, in this case penknives for a specialist market. A symbol of the best not just in Britain, but throughout the world. A vast range of products from Sheffield, all the way to glorious silver salvers, ornate dinner table pieces made by the firm of butlers, also under pressure from imports. So who are they frightened of? The Japanese?
Not a bit worried about Japan today. Japanese costs are not vastly different from ours. And as the Japanese living standards grow, obviously, they get less competitive. The problem countries are the very low-cost countries, such as Korea, Taiwan. I see the Philippines emerging. And, of course, Red China is the one to watch.
In the clothing industry, too, a story of decline. Many factories once serving the big multiples have been forced into closure by import penetration, which was less than 10% in 1970 and now over 50%. So what are they asking for?
I mean, we're not asking for example, the 53% import penetration on suits in the UK to be reduced to 5%. I mean, that's impractical because we wouldn't be able to get back our factories to rebuild our production again. What we're asking for is enough is enough. And this growth of import penetration has got to be reduced.
We've asked the government constantly for a market share. We've asked them to put a quota on imported cutlery, particularly table cutlery, so that we're left with an identifiable market share. We would be happy with half the market.
What could be more reasonable? Why should we allow vast imports of goods that we could make ourselves? Well, the danger of import controls is in throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We export as well as import, and there are great benefits to be gained from international trade.
There are three main ways in which benefits can arise from international trade. Consider two countries, each with the same-sized, equally industrious workforce. First, the lush island of Trivia. In Trivia, the workforce produces just balloons, a skill handed down through the generations. In the bazaars of Bulgaria, the workforce concentrates entirely on socially useful garden gnomes. So the first gain from international trade is obvious, that the two countries can enjoy products that they can't make themselves. But secondly, and more commonly, it's a matter of getting hold of goods more cheaply. Suppose they each make both gnomes and balloons. Half a day's work in Trivia produces only 10 gnomes. The afternoon shift achieves 100 balloons. In Bulgaria, it's the other way round, better at gnomes than balloons. 20 gnomes are made in the morning, just 50 balloons in the afternoon. So there are the figures. Bulgaria has what's called an absolute advantage in gnomes. Trivia, in the same way, has an absolute advantage in making balloons. It's easy to see that if each specializes in what it's best at, then there'll be more of everything. In Trivia, spending a whole day's work will double its output to 200 balloons. In Bulgaria, by spending the afternoon as well as the morning in making gnomes, a further 20 are produced. Total output is increased, and by trading, both countries are better off. So far, so commonsensical. But what's surprising is the gain from international trade in a third situation. Here we find the workforce of Trivia inept at making both gnomes and balloons. Just 8 gnomes and 80 balloons is a whole day's output. In Bulgaria, though, a day's work will produce 20 gnomes and 100 balloons. But though they're absolutely better at making both, the Bulgarians will still find it pays to specialise and trade. Since half a day's work in Bulgaria produces either 20 gnomes or 100 balloons, then to produce one more gnome means not producing 5 balloons. But in Trivia, one more gnome would involve not making 10 balloons. So in Bulgaria, one gnome equals 5 balloons, and in Trivia, one gnome equals 10 balloons. Bulgaria has a comparative advantage in producing gnomes, and it will pay Bulgaria to concentrate on gnomes if it can then trade at any rate between one gnome equals 5 balloons and one gnome equals 10 balloons. Suppose that trade actually takes place at the rate of one gnome equals 8 balloons. Then Bulgaria is happy to exchange a gnome for 8 balloons, because that's more than the 5 balloons it could have produced itself in the same time. And Trivia is also happy because it's getting an additional gnome for only 8 balloons rather than the 10 balloons it would have had to have foregone if it had produced the gnome itself. The Ricardian theory of international trade said that specialisation according to comparative advantage would benefit both countries even when one could produce both goods absolutely more cheaply than the other.
A very powerful argument that international trade benefits all concerned, even when one country can in absolute terms produce everything more cheaply than another. In view of the strength of this classical case for free trade between nations, what are the arguments put forward by manufacturers for protection?
I think that we were the first industry to feel the unfair competition from overseas. It's easy to manufacture clothing in most countries because all you need is a basic sewing machine. You can put your low-price labour to work, especially if it's subsidised by American aid.
In a place like Korea, the labour conditions are so different from here. There's a relentless work pace. There is no union protection for workers. They work or they starve.
As far as the communist countries are concerned, it's what we call political pricing. They ensure full labour usage. In other words, they have very little unemployment in those countries, and they make sure that the merchandise is sold at a much higher price on the home market than they sell to this country. And the object of selling to this country, and indeed our other EEC partners, is to obtain hard currency, so they can in turn pay for some of their imports around the world.
But the fact of the matter is when 95% of the units of stainless steel knives, forks and spoons are coming in at prices that are less than the cost of material here, that isn't competition. It's totally unfair. And that they start off with steel at a subsidised price. Of this I'm sure. We do know that they pay much less for steel than we pay in Europe. Import controls would give us a lifeline. They would give us breathing space.
Well, on the first point, free traders would say that cheap labour simply reflects other countries' comparative advantage.
I'm sure that there are low wages and bad conditions in many developing countries, and conditions there often are extremely bad. The question one has to ask then is whether this in itself is unfairness. I think my point there would be that these are poor countries, many of them, and as a consequence of the fact that they are poor countries, wages are inevitably low. In some cases they could be improved, but it is a fact of life. And I think one then has to go on to ask, well, if it is unfair for these countries to produce labour-intensive goods, which is where the problem lies, what should they be producing? Are we saying they should revert to a colonial-type economy and export only commodities? Or should they export high-technology items? Of course, they haven't got the technology for that. What should they do? I mean, they export these goods because those are the products that they produce best.
As to the arguments about dumping or subsidies, free traders claim that they're often just an excuse for inefficiency, or that anyway consumers benefit from low import prices. And tariffs to protect infant industries or give breathing space, well, generally, they protect geriatric inefficiency and never get removed. That's what the textbooks often say.
Well, being awfully honest, I suppose I would follow the feeling of the textbooks, but I don't think we will ever see import controls for an indefinite period. I think one has to put a time limit. Anything less than 5 years is useless from an investment point of view. One would hope that after 5 years, one would have improved one's efficiency and improved one's competitive stance.
Such pleas for protection don't cut much ice with a company that makes its living selling buses all over the world. During the past 10 years, Paul Sykes has built up a successful exporting firm and holds the view that many British manufacturers are too timid and should be eager to adapt to the challenges from abroad.
What would I tell them companies? Short term is simply that diversification away from the things that they just can't find that can possibly compete with.
Into new lines of business?
Into different lines, maybe in the similar line to what they are already in.
Well, that's interesting. I'd like to know which sectors those are going to be, particularly with the 3 million plus unemployed.
And here we come to the nub of the argument. The theory of free trade assumes, one, that there's already full employment. There's not much point in releasing more resources if some are already lying idle. And two, that labour and capital can be moved to alternative and more efficient uses. What's more, as Terry Ward suggests, it's a static theory that ignores the effects of technological change.
The problem with free trade is well illustrated by the example of Bulgaria producing gnomes and Trivia producing balloons. If Bulgaria, for example, invent a more efficient way of producing gnomes, which require many fewer people to produce those gnomes, the question then arises, what do we do with the additional people that aren't employed? And the most obvious thing might be for them to start producing balloons, in which case Trivia would have no one to sell their balloons to because Bulgaria would, in a sense, be self-sufficient in both gnomes and balloons. That might mean much higher levels of unemployment in Trivia for those people who used to be producing balloons. The problem then is whether one can transfer these people into producing other things. So the difficulty with free trade is that it doesn't necessarily guarantee full employment of a country's resources and labour.
The Cambridge Economic Policy Group believes that Britain is in just this plight. That's why, for the last decade, they've advocated general import controls. A siege economy providing manufacturers with a quiet life behind secure tariff walls? And Terry Ward sees it differently.
The basic argument is really that one needs import controls in order to enable reflation to take place, in order to allow full utilisation of resources. The problem at the present time is that if the government decided to stimulate demand in the economy, either by increasing public expenditure or reducing tax rates, then what would happen is that a high proportion of the extra demand created would actually be spent on imported products rather than going on domestic products and providing jobs, employment for people in this country. And therefore, these balance of payments problems which would materialise with reflation mean that the government is unable to actually carry out a programme of reflation, is unable to provide a sufficient level of output and employment in the economy to employ all the people. Now, what we're advocating is not selective import controls to prop up inefficient industries, but really general across-the-board tariffs in order to protect the balance of payments as reflation takes place. So that these would be tariffs applied generally across the board, and they wouldn't prop up inefficient industries. The problem at the present time is that as industry after industry declines, the government is forced into a position where it's propping up in terms of paying extra subsidies in order to prevent even higher unemployment. Now, with the scenario that I'm trying to portray, the government might easily be in a position where it could withdraw subsidies from declining industries simply because there were additional jobs being created in expanding sectors of the economy.
Is the policy practicable? We're involved in all sorts of international agreements. There's bound to be a lot of retaliation.
Yes, there is certainly a difficulty with regard to retaliation. I mean, given the high level of unemployment in very many countries at the present time, then it's highly likely that there would be a danger of retaliation. As against that, there is the risk of ever increasing unemployment if something is not done about the situation. And as far as I'm concerned, and as far as many people are concerned, a policy of reflation combined with import controls, combined with a certain amount of devaluation, is really the only option that's left to us in order to employ all our people. What we have to do is to convince other countries that they won't necessarily be worse off because we've imposed import controls.
It's very difficult to see how in the existing rules of international trade you could get away with that system. You can get away with an emergency balance of payments package of import quotas, probably lasting for a year, 18 months. The GATT and the EC countries would wear that, but the Cambridge people are not talking about that. They're talking about 5, 10, 15 years, and there really is no way in which we could get away with that kind of policy without provoking very serious retaliation against British exporters.
If we put the drawbridge up for one company, then it's for them all, and I can see the companies that aren't competitive, you know, getting some business. The businesses that are competitive are losing out. This to me is more unfair than leaving it all alone to free market forces.
And if you do discriminate in this way, you are discriminating against your most efficient industries, which are your exporters.
And how do we balance the interests of British consumers, who want to pay the lowest possible prices, against those of British workers, anxious to protect existing jobs and reduce unemployment?
There are costs to the consumers, to the economy as a whole, from buying stuff locally, which can produce much more cheaply overseas.
If there's no manufacturing or industrial base in this country, then there's no jobs for anybody in industry, and there's no jobs for you, and you won't be able to go and buy a suit, whether it be Korean, a British one, or what have you.
Well, in terms of employment, I think we could probably get unemployment down to below 2 million with this kind of policy. It might require tariff levels of 25% or even higher. But as opposed to that, if we continue with the present policies, I would see unemployment of at least 4 million and perhaps even 5 million by 1990. So we're talking about a difference in unemployment levels of about 3 million.
The daunting question is, can we regain our international competitiveness? Or must we control imports, either formally or through still further unemployment?
There isn't a manufactured product in the Western world that is safe if the Far Eastern countries put their heart and soul into making it at a very low cost.
A nation of 50 to 60 million people needs industries such as ours to employ people in reasonable conditions and in reasonable working practices and earning reasonable wages. Otherwise, we're going to have a social disaster.
It's very, very difficult, I'm sure, for a lot of companies, but we've got to realise in the real world, even within Great Britain itself, we've got to learn to compete. We have just got to learn to compete. How long can we go on saying, well, we're not competitive, please help us out?
You may be interested to know that Peter Donaldson has written a book, 10 Times Economics, published by Penguin, price £1.50, available from booksellers.
That ends schools programmes for today. They start again tomorrow morning at the usual time of 9:30. Programmes for Monday lunchtime here on Anglia. At 12:10, Rainbow and the story of the goose that laid the golden egg. Young People Today at 12:30 reports on Japan, and at 1:30 after news at 1, it's tea time in Farmhouse Kitchen. The Monday film matinee at 2 is Melba. Now, Cockleshell Bay.